You stand in the rain outside SS headquarters in Berlin, and the water runs down your face like tears you are not permitted to shed, mixing with the fear that tastes of copper on your tongue. The year is 1940, and you are 29 years old. A Swedish businessman named Kurt Gerstein, who until 3 months ago lived a life of comfortable obscurity, importing medical supplies and believing that the world, despite its darkness, operated according to rules that made some kind of sense. That belief died the day you received the telegram, the one that told you your sister-in-law, Bertha, had been taken, that she had disappeared into the Nazi euthanasia program like a stone dropped into deep water, and that no amount of money or influence or pleading could bring her back. The building before you is gray stone, monumental in the way that structures built by empires always are, designed to make individual humans feel small and insignificant against the machinery of state power. You have rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, standing in front of your bathroom mirror in your apartment in Tübingen, practicing the expressions, the posture, the ideological fervor you will need to convince them that you are one of them. Your hands shake, not from cold, but from the recognition that you are about to step across a threshold that cannot be uncrossed, that you are choosing to put on the uniform of the executioner in the desperate hope that you might save even one life from the killing. Inside, the corridors smell of floor polish and cigarette smoke, and something else, something you cannot quite identify but that makes your skin crawl, a scent like metal and fear and bureaucratic indifference to suffering. You are processed, interviewed by men whose faces are forgettable in their ordinariness, clerks and officers who ask you about your technical background, your expertise in public health and sanitation, your loyalty to the Reich. You lie, smoothly, convincingly, telling them what they want to hear about racial purity and the necessity of difficult measures and the historic mission of the German people. The words taste like ashes in your mouth, but you speak them anyway, because Bertha is dead and you could not save her, but perhaps you can save others. Perhaps you can become a witness to what is happening in the shadows where the world refuses to look. They accept you, partly because you are useful, an engineer with knowledge of water treatment and disinfection systems, and partly because the SS in 1940 is expanding so rapidly that they need men with technical skills more than they need ideological purity. You are assigned to the Hygiene Institute, a name so mundane it could describe a university department, except that this institute is tasked with finding efficient methods to implement the final solution, with turning murder into an industrial process as precise and organized as manufacturing automobiles. Your first assignment takes you to Poland, to a place called Belzec, and the train journey east is a descent into a geography of nightmare. The Polish countryside rolls past your window, fields and forests and villages that look peaceful in the summer light, and you press your forehead against the glass and wonder how beauty and horror can exist in such proximity, how the same sun that warms the wheat also illuminates the killing grounds. You carry papers that identify you as SS Obersturmführer Gerstein. The rank sits on your collar like a brand, and when other officers nod to you in the corridor, you nod back and feel a piece of your soul detach and float away like ash from a fire. Belzec is not marked on any map,
It exists in the blank spaces between towns, hidden among pine forests where the trees grow so thick that sunlight barely penetrates to the forest floor. You arrive in August of 1942, and the commandant, a man named Christian Weert, whose eyes are dead in a way that suggests he killed his conscience long ago, greets you with enthusiasm because you represent Berlin, because you bring expertise in the technical problems of mass murder. He walks you through the camp, and you see the wooden barracks, the railway siding where cattle cars arrive daily, the brick building that Weert calls the bathhouse, but which you understand immediately is something else entirely. The smell reaches you before you see anything, a stench so overpowering that your stomach heaves and you have to force yourself not to vomit, because showing weakness here would be dangerous, would mark you as unreliable. It is the smell of death. Not the clean death of a hospital or battlefield, but death on an industrial scale, bodies decomposing in pits that are too shallow and too numerous, the sweetish, sick odor of human decay that clings to your clothing and hair and will haunt your dreams for whatever remains of your life. Weert explains the process, matter-of-factly, the way an engineer might explain a water treatment system, and you listen with your face frozen in an expression of professional interest, while inside you are screaming. The trains arrive, packed with Jews from across occupied Europe, people who have been told they are being resettled, that they will work in the East, that their families will be kept together. They are driven from the trains, men separated from women and children, stripped of their clothing and possessions, herded naked through a corridor the guards call the tube, toward the building where diesel engines pump carbon monoxide into sealed chambers.
Worth watches your face, searching for something, perhaps revulsion or approval, or the blank professional distance that marks a man who has learned to see humans as problems to be solved rather than lives to be mourned. You give him nothing, or rather, you give him what he expects, nodding at appropriate moments, asking technical questions about efficiency and capacity and disposal methods, playing the role of the SS officer so completely that you almost lose yourself inside it. He tells you the current system is inadequate, that the diesel engines are unreliable, that sometimes they fail, and the people trapped inside the chambers pound on the walls for hours before the gas finally does its work. And he needs your expertise to find something better, something cleaner, something more efficient. You tell him you will investigate alternatives, and this is why you are here, why you volunteered for this descent into hell, because you need to see with your own eyes what is happening. You need to gather evidence that the world cannot dismiss as rumor or propaganda or the exaggerations of a defeated enemy. You take notes, careful, detailed observations written in the neat handwriting of an engineer documenting a process, except that the process you are documenting is the systematic annihilation of human beings. You record the dimensions of the gas chambers, 3 meters by 5 meters by 1.9 meters high, designed to hold 200 people at a time, though the guards often force in twice that number because the more tightly packed the victims are, the faster the carbon monoxide does its work. You witness an arrival because Worth insists you must see the entire operation to understand the technical challenges, and you stand on a small rise overlooking the railway platform as the train pulls in with its cargo of souls. The doors slide open, and people spill out into the August heat, disoriented and exhausted from days locked in cars without food or water or sanitation. Children cry,
The elderly stumble and fall, and the guards shout in German and Polish and Yiddish, driving the crowd forward with clubs and whips and the barking of dogs trained to bite anyone who moves too slowly. You watch a mother with two small children, a boy perhaps 5 years old, and a girl who cannot be more than 3, and the mother is trying to keep them close, trying to shield them with her body from the chaos and violence surrounding them. She looks up briefly, her eyes meeting yours across the 50 meters that separate you, and in that moment you see her recognize what you are, see her understand that the uniform you wear marks you as one of the architects of her destruction. There is no hatred in her expression, only a terrible sadness, a grief so profound it seems to encompass not just her own fate, but the fate of the entire world that has led to this place, this moment, this impossible choice between dying with dignity or dying in terror. You break eye contact first because you cannot bear it, cannot bear the weight of her silent accusation, and you turn away and pretend to examine your notebook, while inside you are fragmenting into pieces that you fear will never fit back together. The processing continues, the sorting of possessions, the cutting of hair from the women, because even in death they are valuable for what can be harvested from them. And then the naked crowd is driven into the tube, a fenced corridor lined with branches to conceal what lies at the end. The diesel engines start, a sound like mechanical thunder, and Worth checks his watch with the concentration of a man timing an industrial process. 25 minutes, he tells you, sometimes longer if the engines are not running properly, and you stand there in the summer heat, listening to sounds you will spend the rest of your life trying to forget. When the doors finally open, when the Sonderkommando prisoners are forced to drag out the bodies twisted together in their final agony, when you see the mother and her 2 children still locked in an embrace that not even death could break, you excuse yourself and walk quickly behind a building where you vomit until there is nothing left inside you but bile and shame. But you do not leave. You cannot leave, because leaving would mean these deaths serve no purpose, would mean that you put on this uniform and damned your soul for nothing. You force yourself to return, to continue your inspection, to ask more questions, to fill your notebook with the details that will become your testimony when the world finally decides to listen. You visit other camps, Treblinka, where the killing is even more efficient, where they have perfected the process until it runs with the precision of a factory assembly line. You see the pits where bodies are burned, thousands at a time, the smoke visible for kilometers, the smell carried on the wind to nearby villages whose inhabitants claim they do not know, do not understand, cannot possibly imagine what the smoke means.
You try to tell. This is the mission you have set yourself, the reason you can continue to wear the uniform without putting a bullet in your own brain. You approach the Swedish embassy in Berlin, your own government. Surely they will listen. Surely they will care. You meet with the diplomat Baron von Otter on a train from Warsaw to Berlin in August of 1942, and you tell him everything, every detail, every horror, speaking for hours while he listens with an expression that shifts from skepticism to horror to a kind of paralyzed disbelief. He promises to report what you have told him, to forward your testimony to Stockholm, to the Allies, to anyone who will act. You wait. Weeks become months, and nothing happens.
No response comes, no bombers appear over the camps, no international outcry disrupts the machinery of death that continues to operate with increasing efficiency. You realize slowly that the world does not want to know, that the truth you are offering is too terrible to accept, too enormous to process, and that it is easier to dismiss you as a liar or a madman than to confront the implications of what you are describing. You try again and again, because what else can you do when you have seen what you have seen, when you carry inside you the weight of testimony that burns like acid in your chest? You approach the papal nuncio in Berlin, Cesare Orsenigo, a man of God who surely must care about the systematic murder of innocents, and you sit across from him in his office with its crucifix on the wall and its smell of incense and old books, and you tell him about Belzec and Treblinka, about the gas chambers and the pits and the children who die calling for mothers who are already dead. He listens, his face carefully composed into an expression of concern, and when he finishes, he tells you that these are difficult times, that the Church must be prudent, that making accusations without absolute proof could endanger Catholics throughout the Reich. You want to scream at him, want to grab him by his clerical collar and drag him to Poland and force him to stand where you stood and smell what you smelled. But instead, you thank him for his time and walk out into the Berlin streets feeling more alone than you have ever felt in your life. You contact the Swiss legation, neutral Switzerland. Surely they will relay your information to the Allies. You speak with representatives, fill out reports, provide maps and diagrams and estimates of the dead that sound like numbers from a census of hell. 6,000 Jews murdered daily at Belzec alone, you tell them, and they write it down with fountain pens on official stationery and file it away in folders that will gather dust in archives while the killing continues unabated. Your position within the SS gives you access, terrible access, privileged access to the machinery of genocide, and you use it to gather more evidence, because evidence is the only weapon you possess. You are ordered to procure Zyklon B, the pesticide that has been repurposed for murder, because it is more reliable than diesel exhaust, more efficient, more German in its precision. You visit the Degesch company, the manufacturers, and you negotiate quantities that make the executives smile, because you are ordering not kilograms but tons, enough to delouse entire armies, they think, though you and they both know that human lice are not the intended target. You divert some of the Zyklon B, small amounts, carefully documented, because you need physical evidence, samples that cannot be dismissed as fantasy or exaggeration. You photograph documents, requisition orders, transportation schedules, the bureaucratic paper trail of mass murder that the Reich produces with Germanic thoroughness, because even genocide requires proper filing. Every photograph is a risk. Every copied document could mean your arrest and execution, but the risk feels meaningless compared to the scale of what you are documenting, compared to the millions who are dying while the world looks away. Your wife, Elfrida, knows something is wrong, sees the way you wake screaming in the night, the way you cannot eat without thinking of the starving prisoners, the way you flinch at the sound of train whistles. You cannot tell her, cannot burden her with knowledge that could get her killed, so you lie and say it is the stress of your position, the demands of wartime service, anything except the truth that would shatter the fragile normalcy you are trying to maintain. She tries to comfort you, brings you tea, and touches your shoulder, and tells you that the war will end eventually, that you will survive and rebuild your life. And you nod and say nothing, because you know that even if your body survives, your soul is being excavated piece by piece like ore from a mine.
In 1943, you make contact with members of the German resistance, the Kreisau Circle, intellectuals and clergy and former officers who plot against Hitler from the shadows. You meet them in churches and private homes, speaking in whispers about what must be done, about how to stop the madness, but they are paralyzed by the same problem that paralyzes everyone. How do you stop a machine that encompasses an entire nation, that reaches from the Pyrenees to the Urals, that commands millions of soldiers and the loyalty of tens of millions more, who either believe in the cause or are too frightened to resist? They plan their coup, Operation Valkyrie, the bomb that will kill Hitler and perhaps shatter the Nazi state. But even as they plan, you know it is too late for the Jews of Europe. That even if the coup succeeds tomorrow, millions are already dead, and millions more will die before the camps can be liberated. You continue your double life, SS officer by day, witness and saboteur by night. You falsify reports, small acts of resistance that you hope will slow the killing, claiming that shipments of Zyklon B were damaged in transit, that technical problems required delays, anything to buy time for people whose names you will never know and whose faces you will never see. Sometimes it works. A transport is delayed. A few dozen or a few hundred people survive an extra week, an extra month, though survival in the camps often means only a slower death from starvation or disease or the random violence of guards who have learned to see prisoners as less than human. You witness the evolution of the machinery, how it becomes more efficient, more industrialized, more thoroughly integrated into the German war economy. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, where you are sent in 1944 to consult on expanding the killing capacity, you see the ultimate perfection of the system. 4 large gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, each capable of killing 2,000 people in less than 30 minutes. The bodies cremated in furnaces that operate 24 hours a day, the ashes dumped in rivers or spread on fields as fertilizer. The commandant, Rudolf Hess, shows you the facilities with pride. The pride of a man who has solved a difficult logistical problem, who has made murder efficient and sanitary and thoroughly modern. You take more notes, more photographs, your collection of evidence growing like a cancer, and you wonder what it will take for someone to care. What threshold of horror must be crossed before the world decides to act? The Allied bombers fly overhead. You can hear them at night, see their contrails in the daylight sky, and you know they are hitting factories and rail yards and military installations, but they never hit the camps, never drop their bombs on the gas chambers or the crematoria or the railway lines that bring the transports from across Europe. The war turns, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum like an avalanche, and you watch the Reich begin to crumble from within, while the killing continues with desperate intensity, because the SS knows their time is running out. The trains still arrive, still disgorge their cargo of Hungarian Jews and Polish Jews and Greek Jews, people who have somehow survived until 1944, only to die in the final spasm of Nazi fury. You are ordered to help dismantle the evidence, to supervise the destruction of documents, the demolition of gas chambers, the exhumation and burning of bodies from the mass graves, because Himmler has finally understood that defeat is coming and the victors will want accounting. You refuse where you can, drag your feet,
misfile orders, claim illness or equipment failure or transportation problems, anything to preserve the evidence that will be needed when the reckoning comes. You are not alone anymore. There are others within the SS who have begun to understand that they are serving not a glorious cause, but a criminal enterprise, though most of them are concerned less with morality than with saving their own skins from the justice they know is coming. You are different, or you tell yourself you are different, that you wore this uniform not for career or ideology, but to bear witness, though in your darkest moments you wonder if that distinction will matter to history, if anyone will believe you joined the SS to fight it from within. In April of 1945, you are in Berlin, the city collapsing under Soviet artillery, and you remove your uniform for the last time, burning it in a barrel in an alley while the sky above is orange with fire. You put on civilian clothes, a suit that belonged to your father, and you make your way west through the chaos of Germany's death throes, past columns of refugees and deserting soldiers and Hitler Youth children still clutching rifles they barely know how to hold. You carry your evidence, documents hidden in a false-bottomed suitcase, photographs sewn into the lining of your coat, testimony that has become more precious than gold because you understand that memory alone will not be enough, that the world will deny what happened unless you can prove it with paper and ink and the bureaucratic records the Nazis themselves created. You surrender to French forces in Tübingen, and you tell them immediately who you are and what you have done, expecting perhaps gratitude or at least acknowledgement that you risked everything to expose the Holocaust. Instead, they arrest you because you are SS, because the uniform you wore marks you as complicit regardless of your intentions, and you are thrown into a cell with actual war criminals, with guards and commandants and the men who pulled the triggers and turned the valves. You try to explain, to anyone who will listen, to the French interrogators and later to American investigators, that you are different, that you have evidence, that you tried to stop it.
Some believe you, or at least believe that you believe yourself, but belief is not the same as acceptance. The world in 1945 is not ready for the complexity of your story. It wants simple narratives of heroes and villains, resistors and collaborators, good Germans and bad Germans, and you fit none of these categories cleanly. You wore the SS uniform, that is indisputable, and the fact that you wore it while trying to subvert it from within is a nuance that exhausted, traumatized judges and prosecutors and journalists cannot or will not process. You are held for weeks, then released without charges because the evidence against you is circumstantial, and your testimony corroborates what the Allies are discovering as they liberate the camps. You return to your family, to Elfrida and your children, who barely recognize the hollow-eyed man who left as a husband and father and returned as something else, something damaged beyond repair. You try to resume your life, find work as a mining engineer, attempt to build some kind of normalcy in the ruins of Germany, but the past will not release you, clings to you like the smell of the camps that you can never quite wash away. The Nuremberg trials begin, and you testify, finally tell your story in a forum where you hope it will matter, where the evidence you gathered at such cost can help condemn the architects of genocide. You speak for hours, describing Belzec and Treblinka and Auschwitz, showing the photographs and documents you preserved, naming names and providing details that corroborate the testimony of survivors.
But even here, in the courtroom where the worst crimes in human history are being prosecuted, some look at you with suspicion, wonder if you are telling the truth or merely trying to absolve yourself, whether your testimony is witness or alibi. The man you met on the train, Baron von Otter, the Swedish diplomat to whom you first told the truth about the camps, he confirms your story years later, tells investigators that yes, this man Gerstein came to him in 1942, told him about the mass murder, pleaded with him to inform the world. But by then, you are no longer alive to hear this vindication, because on July 25, 1945, you are found hanging in your cell in a Paris military prison, dead by your own hand or by someone else's, the official record ambiguous about whether it was suicide or murder or some combination of despair and convenience. You are 42 years old, and you leave behind a wife and 3 children and a collection of documents that will be studied by historians for decades, testimony that will be cited in courtrooms and classrooms and museums dedicated to ensuring that the world never forgets. But you also leave behind questions that will never be answered, whether you did enough, whether your presence in the SS saved lives or merely documented their destruction, whether joining the machinery of evil to fight it from within was courage or collaboration or some tragic mixture of both.
The world will argue about you for years, for decades, for as long as people study the Holocaust and try to understand how it was possible, how an entire civilization could descend into systematic murder while the world watched and did nothing. Some will call you a hero, a righteous Gentile who risked everything to expose the greatest crime in history, who wore the uniform of the devil to gather evidence that the devil existed. Others will call you complicit, argue that no matter your intentions, you participated in the machinery of death, that your presence at the camps made you an accessory to murder, regardless of the notes you took or the diplomats you contacted. The truth, if truth exists in a story this complex, this stained with moral ambiguity, is that you were a man who made an impossible choice in impossible circumstances. You saw evil, recognized it for what it was when millions of your countrymen chose blindness or complicity or enthusiastic participation, and you decided that bearing witness was worth the cost of your soul. You understood that someone had to document what was happening, that memory alone would not survive the Reich's attempts to erase its crimes, that future generations would need evidence that could not be dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration or the fevered imaginings of traumatized survivors. But the cost was everything. You spent your final years tormented by what you had seen, by the faces of the children driven into the gas chambers, by the mother whose eyes met yours across the railway platform at Belzec, by the knowledge that your testimony changed nothing while the killing continued, that the diplomats and church officials and Allied commanders you contacted filed away your reports and did nothing, while trainload after trainload arrived at the camps. You died believing you had failed, that your sacrifice meant nothing, that you had damned yourself by putting on the SS uniform without saving enough lives to justify the damnation. History has been kinder to you than you were to yourself, though not uniformly kind, not without reservation. Your testimony at Nuremberg became part of the official record of Nazi crimes. Your documents and photographs entered the archives where they helped convict men like Adolf Eichmann and provided evidence that even Holocaust deniers could not fully dismiss.
The Swedish government eventually acknowledged that von Otter had indeed received your testimony in 1942 and forwarded it to Stockholm, where it was filed away and forgotten because Sweden's neutrality required pretending not to know what everyone knew. Your story raises questions that have no comfortable answers about complicity and resistance, about the moral calculus of joining evil to fight it, about whether the ends can ever justify the means when the means involve wearing the uniform of the SS. Some resistance fighters remained outside the system, risked their lives sabotaging railways or hiding Jews or gathering intelligence, and they did so without ever putting on the uniform of the murderers. You chose a different path, infiltration rather than external resistance, and whether that choice was braver or more morally compromised than the alternatives is something each person must decide for themselves. What cannot be disputed is that you saw, that you refused to look away when looking away would have been easier and safer and more comfortable, that you gathered evidence at enormous personal risk because you understood that truth matters, that documentation matters, that the historical record matters even when the present seems indifferent to it. You were one of the first to tell the world about the Holocaust, one of the first to provide detailed, credible testimony about the gas chambers and the scale of the killing. And the fact that the world did not listen is not your failure, but theirs. In your final letter, written days before your death in that Paris cell, you wrote that you had wanted to see the evil with your own eyes so that you could testify before the world, that you had joined the SS not despite your conscience, but because of it. You wrote that you had tried, God knows you had tried, to stop what was happening, to save who you could save, to preserve the evidence that would condemn the guilty and vindicate the innocent. Whether you succeeded or failed, whether your actions mattered or were rendered meaningless by the scale of the catastrophe, these are questions that haunt not just your memory, but the memory of an entire generation that faced the Holocaust and had to decide how to respond. Your children grew up without you, carrying the complicated legacy of a father who was SS officer and resistance fighter, perpetrator and witness, a man who exists in the moral gray zone that we prefer to pretend does not exist because it makes us uncomfortable, because it forces us to confront the reality that good and evil are sometimes not clearly separated, but hideously intertwined. They defended your memory, insisted that you were a good man who made terrible sacrifices, and perhaps they were right, or perhaps they simply needed to believe it, because the alternative was too painful to accept.
The camps you documented were liberated. Belzec and Treblinka and Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the world finally saw with its own eyes what you had tried to tell them years earlier. The gas chambers stood as monuments to human evil, the crematoria, the pits, the railway platforms where millions arrived and from which none returned. And somewhere in the archives were your notes, your photographs, your testimony, proof that at least one person inside the machinery had tried to stop it, had risked everything to bear witness even when witness seemed futile. This is the story of Kurt Gerstein, a man who joined the SS to expose the Holocaust and died believing he had failed. A man whose courage and compromise, sacrifice and complicity are so tangled together that 70 years later we still cannot separate them cleanly. His story is not comfortable, does not provide the moral clarity we crave, does not offer easy lessons about heroism or villainy. Instead, it offers something more valuable and more disturbing,
a reminder that the choices we face in the presence of evil are rarely between good and bad, but between terrible and worse. That bearing witness sometimes requires becoming complicit, that the price of truth can be the loss of one's soul. And perhaps that is the real lesson, that some truths can only be told by those willing to descend into darkness, that some testimony can only be gathered by those willing to wear the uniform of the enemy, and that we owe them not simple judgment, but the terrible acknowledgement that they paid prices we hope we will never be asked to pay. If this story moved you, if it made you think about courage and complicity, about the weight of witness and the cost of truth, then subscribe to this channel. These are the stories that history tries to forget, the complicated ones, the uncomfortable ones, the ones that refuse to provide easy answers. Hit the notification bell so you never miss these deep dives into the quiet corners of history where ordinary people faced impossible choices. Share this video because Kurt Gerstein's story deserves to be known, deserves to be wrestled with, deserves to survive in memory, even when memory is painful. And leave a comment below. Tell me what you think about the choices he made, whether infiltration was courage or collaboration, whether his testimony justified his uniform. These are conversations worth having, because the questions Gerstein faced are not safely buried in the past, but waiting for us in whatever darkness the future holds. Thank you for watching, and remember that bearing witness, even when it costs everything, matters. It always matters.